Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on AITM attacks and how they're changing the game when it comes to conventional MFA. Last day of RSA. I heard a lot of good parties last night as well. Hopefully that coffee is kicking in because we have some content here. So quick disclaimer slide, and since we're a publicly traded company, safe harbor applies. Introduction on my side, I'm the CISO and Head of Security Research at Zscaler. My name is Deepan Desai, and with me here today is my colleague, Sudeep Singh. He is responsible for tracking our APD threat actor activity. So for the content, we have a jam-packed stuff. We'll start with a quick overview, very brief overview of role MFA plays in the enterprise today. All the insights that we'll be sharing are collected from enterprise traffic globally, over 7,000 organizations. We'll then dive into how the threat landscape is evolving as it comes to targeting different types of MFA that the organizations are leveraging. We do have a real case study where we captured a campaign. We actually were able to also obtain access to the backend infrastructure. So we'll walk you guys through how it looks like from threat actors' perspective as well as user victims' perspective when these type of attacks are being carried out. Followed by a demo. This is where we'll actually show you how those attacks are launched and the user interaction. And then finally, we'll walk through some of the steps that we can do as an industry, as an organization to safeguard ourselves against these type of AITM and MFA bypass attacks. So we will leave enough time at the end for questions. We'll go through the content. We'll have at least 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So quick overview. Everyone hopefully knows multi-factor authentication. It's an extra layer of identity protection against credential theft attacks. I mean, gone are the days where we were saying, hey, you should have strong user password. You should still have strong passwords. Don't reuse your passwords. Another good advice. People since last few years would say, hey, I have MFA, so even if my credentials were to get compromised, I'm safe. That's no longer true. We're seeing that based on the type of MFA organizations are using, the type of TTPs that we're seeing on the threat landscape side as well, and we'll walk you through that. So MFA, it provides you defense in depth approach to kind of challenge the end user to prove what they know and what they have, right? That's where they provide the MFA token. And it's really the industry standard now for any application that's responsible for having any kind of sensitive data to safeguard the IP information. There are many ways enterprises implement MFA. I mean, the first one, hopefully none of them are doing it, but we still see a very small number, which is text message or SMS-based MFA. The second one is application level. This is where you have those apps, Google Authenticator, Microsoft, right? Any of those apps installed on your device, and you're providing that MFA approval. And then the more secure ones are FIDO2 or hardware tokens, keys, things like YubiKey, which is what is highly recommended for any kind of production environment. There are many apps, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. I'm sure many of you folks in the room have some of these apps installed on your phone, and you're leveraging this for MFA when logging into your corporate assets. So what's happening, right? What type of attacks are we seeing? Over the last 2 to 3 years, what we did is we looked at several campaigns. We categorized them into 5 broad buckets. The way we mapped it over here is it's a quadrant. What is the prevalence level of these MFA attacks? How complex are these to execute from a threat adversary perspective, right? And that's what you're seeing. And then also some of these attacks are more geared towards consumer, and there are some that are geared towards enterprises as well as government agencies as well. So we'll look at each of these buckets, how the attack flows, and then we'll look at the examples for adversary in the middle. So let me now have Sudeep walk us through each of these categories, and we'll look at the operational flow.
Yeah, so before we move into the individual MFA attack techniques, we'll discuss quickly about one of them, which is low in prevalence but high in complexity, and that is the one listed at the bottom right. So this technique is basically about abusing the self-enrollment feature, which is used in enterprises. So this feature is used to onboard new employees, and so that the new employees can register their device and enroll into the MFA program. So sometimes what threat actors can do is they can front-run the new employees, and they can essentially guess their credentials and then enroll their own device. Before the employee enrolls the legit device for MFA, the attackers can enroll their own device. We felt like this technique would be good to mention here, even though it is low in prevalence and very high in complexity. But yeah, this is a technique which has been not much documented in public domain and has been used by some of the advanced persistent threat actors.
Yeah, and this technique, if I may add, I mean, the world that we live in, we're seeing insider threat becoming a bigger challenge where, you know, gangs like Lapsus are paying $30,000 a week to your employee to gain access. I wouldn't be surprised if we see these kind of attacks also being carried out from inside the organization.
Yeah, so now let's quickly discuss each and every MFA technique one by one in the order of prevalence and complexity. So the first one we are going to talk about is SIM swapping attack. So this one targets if the enterprise is using SMS as a two-factor authentication method. So to launch this type of attack, the threat actor begins by collecting personal information about the victim. And once they have collected sufficient information about the victim, they reach out to the mobile network operator of the victim's phone connection. And then they use social engineering techniques with the mobile network operator and convince them to transfer the victim's phone number to an attacker-controlled SIM card. And once they're able to successfully do this, the attacker has limited time, because before the victim becomes aware that their phone is no longer functioning or they're not receiving any calls or messages, the attacker sends out a phishing link to the victim to collect the credentials. And once the attacker has collected the credentials, they use these credentials to log into the legit site. And now when the 2FA request, the two-factor authentication request is initiated, it will be sent to the attacker-controlled SIM card instead of the victim's phone number. So once they're able to do it successfully, the account takeover happens. And this technique is still prevalent because there are still enterprises out there which are still using SMS as a two-factor authentication method. The next one we'll talk about is social engineering combined with real-time messaging services. So there are multiple ways to launch this type of attack. So the one we have represented here is where the attacker sends out a phishing link to the victim. The victim is interacting with the phishing site. So what you see at the top, half is a fake session between the victim and the phishing site, and the bottom half shows the real session between the attacker and the legit site. So the victim enters the credentials on the phishing site, and then these credentials are relayed to the attacker using a real-time messaging service. So real-time messaging service could be any chat program like Telegram as an example. So Telegram API can be used to quickly relay the information as soon as the victim enters the credentials on the phishing site. So once the attacker gets the first level credentials, which are typically username and password, the attacker logs into the legit site. And now the legit site is going to initiate a two-factor authentication. And the two-factor authentication request goes to the victim's phone, which is step number 4 at the top. Now, the phishing site will display to the victim a fake web page to ask for the 2FA code. So because the victim is not aware that they are interacting with the phishing page, so the victim enters the 2FA code on the phishing page, which is once again relayed to the attacker through the real-time messaging. So the attacker now has everything required to log in successfully to the account. So the attacker enters the 2FA code on the page and successfully logs in. Now, the most critical component here is real-time messaging, because timing is essential, because two-factor authentication codes are valid only for a short duration, typically 60 seconds. So the attacker has to quickly get this information, and that's why they use real-time messaging. We have looked at several campaigns in the wild, and this technique, even though the attribution game is not easy, but we have seen this technique being used by not just regular threat actors, but even advanced persistent threat actors. Just to give a quick example, this technique has been used by an APT group called APT37, which is attributed to North Korea. And just recently, they used this technique to target individuals in South Korea. So following the order of prevalence and complexity, the next attack we'll talk about is MFA fatigue attack. So as the name here says, fatigue, it's about exhausting the victim by sending a lot of push notifications. So some of you who are familiar with applications like Okta or Microsoft Authenticator, they send you push notifications on the phone. So to explain this attack, we decided to use a flowchart. So the first step, we assume that the attacker has already collected the username and password of the victim, the first level credentials. And from here on, the attacker logs into the target site with the stolen credentials. Since the credentials are correct, that will initiate an MFA push notification, which is sent to the victim's phone device. Now, one of the two things can happen. Either the victim will accept the push notification. If they do, then the account takeover successfully happens immediately. And if they don't, then the attacker can take one of the two options. Either the attacker can continue spamming push notifications again and again to the victim's phone device, and that's where the name fatigue comes from, because the victim might see a lot of push notifications coming on their device and might accidentally accept one of them. And if in case that still doesn't happen, then the attacker can choose another route, and that is they can choose to use social engineering technique in combination with the MFA fatigue. So typically what we see is the threat actors reach out to the victim, and they pretend to be someone working with the IT team of that enterprise. And they ask the user to accept the push notification which they're receiving on the device with the excuse of like doing some sort of account maintenance. So once essentially the attacker is able to successfully social engineer the victim, the account takeover happens successfully. So this technique is increasing in prevalence, and in fact, last year, there were several high-profile enterprise breaches where the root cause was MFA fatigue attacks. The next one we'll talk about is adversary in the middle, AITM. This is the main topic of today's presentation. So in the case of AITM attack, the threat actor positions themselves in the form of a transparent proxy sitting between the victim and the target site. So as we have shown here, there are three verticals: the victim, AITM infrastructure, which is maintained by the attacker, which sits in between the victim and the target site, and then you have the legit service which is being targeted. So the way the attack is launched is the attacker sends out a phishing link to the victim, either through email or some other messaging application. The victim enters the credentials on the phishing page. These credentials are relayed by the attacker's infrastructure to the target site. But before relaying, they even log the credentials. Then the credentials are forwarded to the legit site. The legit site authenticates. If they are correct, then it will initiate an MFA request, a two-factor authentication request. Now, this request is further relayed by the attacker to the victim. So once the victim completes the MFA authentication on the device, the response from the victim is again forwarded by the attacker to the target site. And since now all the authentication steps have completed, the target site is going to generate a session cookie, and this session cookie will be forwarded to the victim's browser so that the victim can successfully log into the legit site. But before that, the attacker is even going to log the session cookie at their end. So this session cookie can be reused by the threat actor to log into the victim's account, even without the username and password. So we are seeing an increase in prevalence of AITM attack in the wild, and the reason for the increase in prevalence is what we'll talk about in the further slides. So before we talk about why exactly these attacks are reducing in complexity and increasing in prevalence, let's actually look at what's out there so far in the past few years. So there are several open source AITM phishing kits which are public, available on code repositories like GitHub. So anyone can access these phishing kits and try to mount an attack. So a quick overview of some of the popular phishing kits available in public domain. So EvilGenX, Muraina, and Modlishka are the three most popular open source phishing kits, specifically for AITM attacks. And few attributes of these phishing kits, so they are all modular in architecture, which means that they allow extensibility with plugins. So an attacker can write plugins and extend the features provided by the phishing kit. And these plugins are in the form of fishlets. So fishlets here means templates for phishing a specific site. So for example, if you're targeting Gmail, there will be a template specifically for Gmail. If you're targeting Microsoft, then there will be a template for that. So the technical term for that is fishlets, but you can think of them like a template. So even though there are open source phishing kits, and it may sound like it's very easy for anyone to pull off these type of attacks, but there are certain challenges. And the challenges are that these repositories, the code base which is public, it is outdated and it's not regularly maintained by the authors. So we've included a screenshot here on the left-hand side. This is from a GitHub repository of one of the most popular open source phishing kits for AITM called EvilGenX. And as we have highlighted here, that the last code update was more than 2 years ago, which means that these phishing kits are outdated and they are not compatible with the latest security and defense mechanisms used by popular sites like Gmail and Microsoft and so on. So essentially, these phishing kits are broken, and an attacker cannot simply use the open source phishing kits to mount the attack. So the other thing is that in order to do these type of attacks, it requires advanced skill from the threat actor's point of view, because it's not a conventional phishing attack. Here, the attacker also needs to set up an infrastructure, which we looked at before, like setting up a proxy-based architecture, and so on. So now that we've looked at some of the challenges in conducting an AITM attack, a phishing attack, we'll talk about why exactly the prevalence is increasing, and that is where the phishing as a service business model comes into picture. So what we saw last year was there was a availability of a new phishing as a service called EvilProxy, which makes it very easy for any threat actor to mount these type of attacks. And the way they work is the threat actor, the main controller of this phishing as a service, they maintain the entire infrastructure. And for any other threat actor, they just need to rent this from the main controller. So these type of, basically the availability of phishing as a service, it lowers the entry, the barrier to entry of these type of attacks, and makes it very easy for anyone to mount the attacks now. We'll quickly look at the business model. So here is an advertisement on the left-hand side, which is posted by the threat actor on an underground forum where they're advertising this phishing as a service. And without going into too much of details, we've just highlighted some of the key features. So the first one being that it allows any threat actor now to rent access to the phishing templates, and they have support for more than 20 targets, which includes pretty much all the prime targets like email services of Google and Microsoft, file sharing repositories, Dropbox, code package repositories, social media, and so on. So the way it works is that any threat actor can now rent access from the EvilProxy, the main phishing as a service operator, for a time duration they choose, like 10 days, 20 days, or 30 days. And they don't have to maintain the infrastructure by themselves. Everything is taken care of by the operator of phishing as a service.
Yeah, and I guess one of the key component that we found in this case was they were using Azure infrastructure, GCP infrastructure, Dropbox, right? And some of these phishing pages were targeting the destination service itself. So Office 365 phishing page hosted on Azure itself. So these kits basically allow even the folks that are not that advanced to kind of evade detection that Microsoft, Google, AWS, all of those guys have in place. They're continuously updating it. I'll walk you guys through one of the campaign that the team discovered over the last 6 to 9 months. This is still prevalent. In this case, the evil proxy kit was being leveraged by the threat actors. They were targeting many large organizations across the globe in fintech, lending, energy sector, manufacturing, and the goal over here was to steal access and then IP information as well in some of the cases. It starts with fingerprinting, right? I mean, if you looked at social engineering, you looked at AITM, the AITM infrastructure allows for these bad guys to actually fingerprint the victim environment before they go to the next step. So in this case, they were using WebSocket-based fingerprinting. This code runs on the browser of the victim. They're able to identify which system, all the system-level stats, and send it to the AITM infrastructure. They will then abuse some of these URL redirects. I mean, I'm showing you a few examples. These are real examples. Double-click, Google Ad Services, Snapchat. So the front part of the URL is that open URL redirector from these legitimate services. And they have one of the parameters, which is the redirect parameter, pointing to the actual phishing domain. And this domain will either be compromised or it will be hosting a page, like I said, on Azure, GCP, or AWS itself. So even the wildcard certificate that these guys are offering will look legitimate to the victim. It's a certificate issued by star.microsoft.com, for instance. Now, so the flow of the attack in this case looks like it starts with an email, or it could be any other messaging mechanism. The URL, you will see a URL pointing to Google, Snapchat. If the victim clicks on it, they will be redirected to this compromised domain. That's where the fingerprinting happens. Is this the intended victim that I want to target? Once that happens, they will be served the actual login page. In this case, I'm showing an example of Gmail. User enters credentials. As Sudeep explained, the AITM infrastructure is making a connection on user's behalf to the actual service. And then the MFA prompt comes up, right? And the MFA gets entered by the user, and now the threat actor has established persistence with the backend. Same thing is true for Microsoft as well. We saw adversaries launching this campaign. We actually have a few decoys set up as well. We fell for this phishing campaign on purpose. We noticed within 6 minutes of us supplying these credentials, there was an automated API call being made to the Office 365 domain, and they were exfilling all the emails and stuff that were there as part of that inbox. Right, so most of the stuff that we're talking about, even though we'll show you some manual step, it's all automated on the attacker's end. So let me now switch to demo, and this is where I'll actually show you how they launch these attacks. Right? So it's a recorded demo. So this is where I guess it will be slightly hard for you guys to see, but the recording will be available. This is where the attacker is typing the victim's email address, for which the URL needs to be generated. So these URLs are also heavily customized. I think this is a better view of the URL. So first view was where the attacker typed the email address. A squatted domain, a domain that looks very similar to the target victim, is where the phishing page will be hosted. And the URL will have the obfuscated or the base 64 encoded version of the victim's email address in many of the real world scenarios. Once the victim clicks on it and enters let's go. Yeah. All right. So once the victim falls for it and enters the credentials, it is going to pull the victim's company logo from Microsoft side, because as we saw, it's basically making connection to the legitimate server. So the logo, all the other information is coming back from legitimate site. Victim enters the credentials. They will then be prompted for MFA, boom. In this case, they have their mobile device being used for MFA. A push notification comes up, approval happens, And now, the victim is logged in. As far as victim is concerned, they just logged into their Office 365 tenant. They will also be asked if they want to persist this connection, don't want to do this MFA again, regardless of the victim's choice over here. Threat actor is intercepting this, so they're able to always say stay connected. So victim is logged in. We'll switch on the attacker's side as well and see while this victim was entering all of this information, the threat actor's infrastructure is actually logging in username, password, the entire session cookie. All of this gets stored in a database, which is part of this phishing kit. Right? And we'll run a command to show you what that session cookie looks like as well. Here, 1 second. So that's the session cookie. Right? This is stored for every single victim that falls for the attack. And then they're able to use this. We're showing you a very easy way for anyone to log in using this. Right? You're basically editing a cookie, but it's very trivial to achieve this using a Python script or any kind of scripting language. And that's what these AITM kits will do for the threat actor. So the API call that I mentioned, once the session cookie is stolen, they will make an automated API call to the infrastructure and steal the email information, personal information from the user's mailbox. And that's basically them entering the cookie, and they're logged in as the victim now, as soon as this request goes out. So no username, password, no MFA needed, they're logged in, and then they're able to maintain persistence from that point onward. So switching back to the slides, we saw these attacks mainly targeting end users for most part up until July, August timeframe last year. And then, can we switch back to the slides, please? All right. So starting August, what we saw was threat actors started going after GitHub, right, your code repos. And it's the same infrastructure that they were using, but now they're serving GitHub login pages. The user is trying to log into their code repo. They will receive an email that's well-crafted that says, hey, you have a code commit that you need to review, something similar like that. And then when they click on it, they will now be logging into GitHub via AITM infrastructure. Right? And now this has significantly higher impact on the target organization, because now it's the IP information that is being leaked. And we saw a couple high-profile cases disclose a breach where the back-end infrastructure was AITM infrastructure, right? So there are two attack paths that I'm showing you over here. The left side is where we already have victims documented, where the attacker was able to pop GitHub repository. They cloned the victim's repository, stole all the code base, and they were able to successfully execute that attack. The right side, which is even more dangerous, is they have access to your code. If it's a privileged account, they can now use it to commit malicious code as well and conduct supply chain attacks. Right? Supply chain attacks, we're seeing more and more of those. 3CX was one of them that we saw, thousands of users being targeted. But this is fairly dangerous, and this is where we need to seriously look at the MFA that we have implemented, at least for our crown jewel applications. We can't rely on this conventional way of doing MFA. So I did show you guys a little bit of the attacker's view, but we'll double click on some of the aspects why it makes it trivial for these guys to automate some of the workflows that we just walked through. So there are two major components. One is the admin panel, and we'll walk through each of the phases. And there are actually chat groups. So when we got access to it, there were chat groups using which all of these guys were actively collaborating while these campaigns were being executed, right? Okay, this is working out, this is not. There's a fair bit of active collaboration happening, and then they're also updating the kit, the pages, as these campaigns were being conducted. So Sudeep, maybe you can walk us through some of the admin panel components.
Yeah, so we managed to get access to admin panels of some of the in-the-wild AITM phishing attacks. And that gave us a lot of insight into how these threat actors are not only managing the campaigns, but also like collaborating with each other, as Deepan just pointed out. So let's quickly look at some of the screenshots which we captured by logging into the admin panel of the threat actor. So now we are looking entirely from the attacker's perspective, what they see. So the first screenshot which you see here is the home page of the admin panel and what attacker sees. So at the top is like a quick statistics about like stats about the collection of stolen data, like how many credentials have they stolen and basic stuff like that. And then what we have highlighted here is what does the attacker see about the victim's account. So we can see that the attacker has captured the IP address and the first level credentials like email address and the password, which you would expect with any regular phishing attack as well. But in addition to that, we can also see that the attacker has captured the session cookie, which was intercepted using the AITM attack. So as we saw in the demo, the attacker can capture the session cookie, which they can later on reuse to log into the victim's account. In the next screenshot, what we are seeing is the admin panel allows the threat actor to generate malicious attachments automatically, which they can use again in phishing campaigns. So the threat actor doesn't have to code any of this stuff manually. It all comes like a ready-made recipe. All they have to do is click a few buttons and generate the malicious attachment, customized specifically for the victim's email address. In the next screenshot, we are looking at some of the settings of the admin panel. Now, this is very interesting from the point of view of how these threat actors are interfacing with the main operator, the phishing as a service. So as we described earlier, that phishing as a service is like the main controller or the operator, and other threat actors are renting access from the main operator. So we can see here in the settings, at the bottom, we can see the API key. API key for phishing as a service is what the threat actors use to get access to the main phishing as a service. So they rent access for, let's say, limited time, like 30 days. So the API key is valid only for the limited time. The other setting we see here is a Telegram bot settings. So this bot token is what allows the threat actor to transfer the stolen information from the victim to the Telegram bot in real time. So it can be like, instead of Telegram bot, it can be anything else as well, but that's what we saw because Telegram is heavily abused by threat actors due to anonymity. Now we'll talk about the collaboration piece between the threat actors. So as Deepan mentioned about the chat group, so what we saw was these threat actors are very actively exchanging tips and suggestions with each other and essentially describing how the attackers can maintain their campaign for as long as possible by evading the security products. So what we see at the bottom left is essentially a set of 6 or 7 points where the main controller of phishing as a service is suggesting other threat actors to follow certain steps to make sure that their domains are not blacklisted by security vendors. So, for example, some of the suggestions which they're giving to other threat actors is that not to use a newly registered domain because a lot of security vendors are keeping an eye on newly registered domains. So they're suggesting not to use newly registered domains, instead go for expired domains, buy them and use them in malicious attacks. In addition to that, they're also suggesting not to go for typo squatting, which is what most threat actors do. Like, for example, if they're targeting Amazon, then they will set a domain name which looks similar to Amazon. So the threat actors are suggesting each other that not to use such a technique so that they don't get caught by the security vendors. Some other examples of collaboration which we saw is like the one on the right-hand side is where the threat actors are suggesting what kind of file format they can use in the email attachments so that they can bypass the email scanning engine. So in this case, they're using SVG file format, which a lot of email scanning engines do not support. So this was a piece about collaboration which shows that threat actors are actively collaborating with each other. Now I'll turn it over to Deepan, and he'll walk you through the impact
Perfect.
of different
Okay,
MFAs.
so we kind of described the problem. We showed you how the bad guys are exploiting it. Before I jump on what can we do to defend against some of the stuff that we're seeing, in terms of the overall impact, we went through several different types of attacks, campaigns. I would say in terms of the severity, anything that targets your intellectual property can cause maximum damage. It's not just credential phishing anymore with these attacks that we're seeing. It can cause an org-wide breach where it's not limited to a single endpoint. The lateral propagation component is one that plays a big role in these org-wide breach as well, because once they have access to one of your assets, one of your credentials, even the social engineering attack that we displayed, if they're able to see other assets in your environment, they will weaponize a payload, exploit vulnerabilities, and move laterally, gaining access to those high privilege assets in your environment, again leading to data exfiltration. Espionage is next. Brand reputation, of course. I mean, you may see and hear about attacks that targeted an area of the enterprise that was not having a lot of sensitive information, but it does lead to a lot of brand reputation impact. And then more and more of these guys are also looking at your internal secrets. So leveraging Slack, leveraging messaging systems that are used internally. As soon as they have access to your user credential, they will look at things that are being exchanged in your environment. So while the impact may not always be very high, it's important to look at that aspect as well. So do external secret scans, but equally do internal secret scans and take action on things that are being shared insecurely in your environment. So one of the key takeaway from the attacker's perspective, like all of these groups that we monitored, how they're operating. I mean, we come from the security vendor side, right? We're on the good side. We talk about different ways in which you can proactively block many of these attacks. I mentioned newly registered domain. I mentioned domain squatting, detection. They're already discussing that part. Hey, let's not use that, otherwise all of these vendors will block our phishing campaigns. They're continuously studying how each of the vendors are blocking their phishing pages, and they evolve. So it's important for us to monitor and also keep up with this evolving TTPs. There is a component on the user training side that I'll talk about, but bad guys are learning what we have in place. They're looking at the infrastructure changes, and they're continuing to change these kits. And phishing as a service makes it trivial for a lot of the folks to just rely on that one specialized group to launch these large-scale attacks. So quick rundown on different types of attacks that we saw and what can the organizations do. My simple suggestion, do not use SMS as an MFA mechanism. If you're still using this, you should seriously reconsider this specific mechanism. The second one, the MFA fatigue attack. When there were a couple public breaches that were announced. Every time there is something like this being notified, I mean, being the CISO, board asks questions, CEO asks questions. Sure, as security professionals, you get asked this thing. Many of these identity providers actually had an option in the panel that's called, in this case, it's called number matching, right? It allows you to beat these kind of fatigue attacks. But when we studied how the organizations are configured, majority of them did not have this option enabled. So if you're still using those app-based MFA, enable number matching in your IDP. Most popular IDP providers have this setting, and you're able to defend against the fatigue attacks using that. Social engineering, this is where it's a combination of how you're employing your MFA mechanism as well as the awareness training part. Personally, on my side, we do continuously updated awareness training. There are phishing simulation exercise. The part that I would call out that you should all consider is training the user at the time they're making the mistake. And that has worked out pretty well for us, for organizations that I work with. So what I'm showing you is an example where a user will see a page, and this is Zscaler employee seeing a page, when they're about to visit a destination that is not categorized, not reputed, they will get a notification, do not enter your password, do not download files from it, do not enter your credit card information, it's not safe. And this piece of educational prompt has itself led to exponentially less number of click-throughs. There are users that will still click through, but you will get to see those as well, right? Okay, this was a bad site, someone still clicked through, what happened after that? But this is very important. If you guys are not leveraging something like this today, highly encourage you guys to do it, because these attacks are evolving in complexity, and it's hard for end users as well to catch some of these phishing pages. AITM attacks, FIDO2-based MFA, highly recommended, right? At least for your crown jewel, you should start leveraging that, or switch to something like hardware tokens. That's what we personally use for our production infrastructure. You do need a TLS inspection-capable inline proxy to defeat these AITM attacks, because they're literally terminating your connection. So unless you terminate that connection and inspect the phishing pages that are going through, the credentials that are passing through, you will have a very hard time blocking these, because like I mentioned, the domains are Azure domains or GCP domains. You can't rely on URL filtering and things like that to defend against AITM-style attacks. So to summarize, I mean, we walked through many of the tactical recommendations, like number matching, beating fatigue attacks. Another recommendation I would give you is, wherever possible, make your applications go dark. Make them invisible by deploying a zero trust infrastructure, hiding them behind a proxy-based system. Second is, and this is where many of these phishing campaigns were successful, is have an ability to prevent compromise by applying consistent security no matter where your users are, whether they are at home, whether they're in the office, or whether they are at RSA conference, right? You should be able to apply consistent security with full TLS inspection. Otherwise, you may have the best of the breed controls when they're in office. You will lose credentials in this manner. Lateral propagation, I can't stress enough, this is the difference between a single asset being compromised versus entire organization getting popped, because once they're able to move laterally and hit your crown jewels, they can do a lot more damage. And then finally, data loss inspection, right? Once the credentials are stolen, the bad guys are after your data, as we demonstrated using the AITM kit as well, where they're actually automatically running those API calls, exfilling data. You need to have inline as well as out-of-band API-based DLP inspection engine to safeguard against these type of attacks. So, well, thank you, folks. Hope you found the information useful. We'll now take questions.
So the fatigue attacks, the one thing that I've tried to convince my organization to do to prevent those is get rid of push notifications, right? Go to a methodology. Ping supports this now, and I'm sure others do, where they can enter their password and whatever the OTP is, or hit their YubiKey, all in the password window, all at one time. I mean, the users don't realize that's actually easier for them because it's a shorter conversation area that's just all done now. But do you think there's a way to campaign various MFA providers to get them to stop using push, because it's just enabling this kind of abuse?
Absolutely. So push-based notification, your users are prone to those attacks that we talked about. But I mean, while you work on convincing your organization to adopt the alternate way, I would still look into enabling the number matching piece. That will also help you defeat these type of fatigue attacks.
Hey, thanks for the great presentation so far. So I'm curious, if there's this man-in-the-middle attack happening, from a log standpoint, would the system detect the location and the IP of the attacker?
Yeah, so basically, when an MITM attack or AITM attack happens, so let's say someone who is managing the Azure Active Directory or Active Directory for the organization In the logs, audit logs will show the IP address where the attacker logged in from. In fact, that is one of the ways to detect the anomaly. Let's say an employee is usually authenticating from US, for an example, and now one day you see a login MFA successful from Germany, so that's an
Yes.
anomaly. So yes.
Right. So with a conditional access policy that requires a
Yes.
compliant device, would that prevent the man in the middle?
Yes, conditional access policy will actually detect a lot of anomalies when it comes to MFA. But one thing to keep in mind is that conditional access policy feature is not provided by default with all the licenses.
Yes.
So if we look at Microsoft, for example, enterprise license E5 and above, only
Yes.
they support conditional access policy.
But when the connection is established and its persistence, in some cases they were also authorizing a third-party plugin access to the account. In those cases, conditional access will not be effective, at least in the first half while that session is active. When it expires, I guess that's when because they're leveraging the end user to do the authentication. They're just serving as a man in the middle and using the active token to perform it. That's why the time at which they're doing it, the speed at which they're doing it, within 5 minutes they're logging in, they're exfilling data, and then it's done.
So that initial device, so the employee is on a compliant device, company-owned device. You've got a man in the middle. That device is passed through as well, so it still appears to be compliant?
That's basically what we're seeing with
Oh,
this.
geez. That's even worse than I
Yeah,
thought.
and I think one more point which can be mentioned here is a device fingerprint step which was mentioned by Deepan in one of the slides. So what the attackers do is, before they launch the phishing attack, they are fingerprinting the device of the victim. So they collect all the information to replicate the victim's device as well. And that is another thing they can do to evade the audit log based, audit.
But your point is valid. They are not able to then continuously log in again and again. It's that session duration, which is where the speed at which they will come in and exfil data, that's what does the damage.
Okay, thank you.
Can you explain what is number matching technique?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, so number matching is a feature provided by a lot of MFA apps like Okta, Microsoft Authenticator. So what exactly it means is, when you receive a push notification from a website, so let's say you entered your username and password, they are correct, and now the website initiates a push notification sent to your phone. So if you enable number matching, now the web page is going to show you a number, and now when you open your app, like Okta app on the phone, it's going to show you like 6 numbers. So you have to choose a number which is shown on the web page, and that's why it's called number matching. And the reason this is done is because let's say an attacker would, so if an attacker is initiating an MFA notification, push notification, then the attacker sees a number on the web page. And on the victim's device, the victim does not know what's the number on the web page. So the idea behind number matching is that the person authenticating on the web page should be the same person approving the push notification on the phone.
Then how is this different from OTP?
How is it different?
One-time password, how is this different from OTP?
So one-time password is an entirely different way of doing an MFA, where in one-time password, it's not going to use like push notification. These are two different things. So push notification, the number which we are talking about is not the one-time password code. It's not the OTP code. It's a different thing. So push notification in itself is an alternative to one-time password. The only thing about the number matching is that to protect against an attacker maliciously doing a push notification acceptance, these are two different numbers, just to keep it like different. Like it's one-time password and the number matching number we are talking about are different. So,
Okay, right. Thank you.
thank you.